Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Around the Empire podcast is listener-supported independent media. Please pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also help me build up the YouTube channel by subscribing. That's free, youtube.com/c/aroundtheempire. Journalist and author Matt Taibbi joins the show to talk about his latest book chapter titled It's Official. Russiagate is this generation's WMD. The Iraq War faceplant damaged the reputation of the press. Russiagate just destroyed it. And we discuss some corporate media reaction to this piece. We think back on the changes to American policy and American life brought about by the WMD lies, the Iraq War and the War on Terror, and the likelihood of serious, real-world consequences of the Russiagate conspiracy. This is one of the reasons why it's so important to re-examine the origins and the details of the Russiagate story now that it has collapsed. But even as the Russiagate conspiracy collapses, the curiously bipartisan consensus on the matter of Russia being a threat to our democracy lives on. Or at least the establishment and national security state are working hard to make sure it survives, even if all or most other aspects of the story die. Matt Taibbi is an author, a journalist, and a contributing editor for Rolling Stone. He won the 2008 National Magazine Prize for columns and commentary. His most recent book is I Can't Breathe, A Killing on Bay Street, about the infamous killing of Eric Garner by the New York City police. He's also the author of New York Times bestsellers Insane Clown President, The Divide, Griftopia, and The Great Derangement. We recorded this interview on March 27th, 2019. Matt Taibbi, thanks for coming on the show and taking the time to talk with me. I'm sure you're swamped, and it's great to meet you.
Great to meet you as well, Joanne.
So, a Washington Post reporter referred to Barr's no collusion announcement on Sunday as a, quote, thunderclap to the mainstream media news outlets. But I would argue that there was another thunderclap this weekend that preceded Barr's announcement, or maybe you call it like a rumble of thunder in the distance that came before the loud clap. And that rumble was a piece that Matt Taibbi published this Saturday, and it's a chapter from his upcoming book, Hate Inc., on his Substack subscription service. And as is your forte, Matt, you chose like a powerful sort of metaphor or comparison even for all of this, the infamous WMDs that were used to lie us into a war, the invasion of Iraq. And the title of the chapter that you gave is, quote, It's Official, Russiagate is this generation's WMD. And let me just read the first paragraph, quote, Nobody wants to hear this, but news that Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller is headed home without issuing new charges is a death blow to the reputation of the American news media, unquote. Now, that's quite a bombshell. I mean, I had to use that word, right?
Yeah, that makes me feel not so good, but that's okay. Go ahead.
Well, no, I'm being facetious, really. But I don't think you were using hyperbole as a rhetorical device that much, right? I mean, I think you were serious. And to be upfront, I fully agree with that estimate.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, it wasn't, there's maybe a little bit of, look, as I say in the piece, the WMD episode had fairly awesome real world consequences,
right?
Hundreds of thousands of lives lost, I think that last count, our Middle East commitment is $5.5 trillion. So, and we have bases and drones all over the area. So this hasn't turned into that yet. What I was really speaking to was the scale of the journalistic error.
Yeah, I understood that. Right.
Yeah, and this was. And this is going to be remembered as worse for a variety of reasons, but mainly because the core issue here wasn't that we sort of did something bad to foreigners as a result of a journalistic mistake. This was an internal domestic sort of, it was part of the ongoing American Civil War, and so this is going to be remembered as a sort of an American on American crime, which doesn't make it worse, but it certainly is going to heighten, I think, the response to it.
Right, and I mean, what I meant by that was that the damage that the WMD story did to journalism, to the media, the reputation of the media, to their ability to justify new wars too, is this Russiagate story is definitely on that scale.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I would argue damage it did to the country too, but not in the same way, not in blood, but well, we can go into later the kinds of damage that it's done.
Sure. No, I mean, I think that the damage that it's done is that it's very much undercut the power of the press to have an impact on society, because in order for us to really have an impact, we have to be trusted and believed. And the relationship between journalists and the public is an important relationship that has to be very, very carefully tended to over time. And what happened with this story is we lost the trust of an enormous segment of the population. I mean, there was a poll before the Barr letter came out showing that 50.3% of the public thought that this story was a witch hunt. So that means a significant portion of beyond that thinks that, at the very least, this reporting was problematic. We can't be effective if 60 to 70% of the country doesn't think that we're on the level. I mean, this doesn't work.
Right. I think that obviously the 9/11 and the Iraq War reporting were, off the scales. But what I've seen over the past 2 years, it's different, and it's like nothing I've ever witnessed in my entire adult life, really.
Mm-hmm.
Although it does remind me, though, I'm sure you remember this, of another special counsel investigation on a much smaller scale. The obvious one, the Starr report, which I think in some ways this was revenge for, but there was another one, and I was one of the eager participants in that one. And when you mentioned Santa Muller, that's what brought it to mind. Do you remember Fitzmas? Remember the Valerie Plame affair?
And yes, of course, yeah.
Remember how that special counsel played out? And interesting, and there's some of the same players like James Comey.
I don't remember actually how the special counsel played out there. I mean, I remember the Plame story, but what happened in that case?
Well, I mean, it went on, and Patrick Fitzgerald was elevated to the sort of godlike state.
Right.
And yeah, and Comey was he was a deputy attorney general at the time, and he was overseeing it. And that was like sort of, if he was sort of the backup savior, or I don't know, maybe you could even put a Trinity thing into this, but he was going to make sure that the Bush administration would never shut this down, because he was, the ultimate integrity.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And then there was all these things about how Karl Rove was going to be indicted, and Jason Leopold had a source that he apparently got burned. And, he took a lot of flack because everybody was waiting in anticipation for Rove to get subpoenaed, and, all this stuff by a grand jury. So there was all this secrecy involved. And in the end, Scooter Libby got a slap on the wrist. I think he immediately got either commuted sentence or pardoned. Dick Cheney walked.
Right.
Yeah. And, and there was all this intrigue about who was the actual leaker, and much smaller scale, but it definitely reminded me of this. And so I'm one of the eager participants, right? So I'm one of the rah-rah Dems saying, Fitzmas, it's all going to happen for Christmas. Yeah, And then it was just this major disappointment with that ended with Fitzgerald saying, "Well, they kept throwing sand in our eyes, and that's
Right.
why I really couldn't take anyone down."
Uh, yeah, no, that's funny. I never thought about that, but that's very similar. It's on a a much smaller scale, but it's it's funny. I think one of the things that happens in these instances is that most reporters have some kind of they're either lit um, graduates. A lot of us have literature degrees, or we have some kind of communications background, or some of them are people who wanted to go into the movie business, and we couldn't do that. So when we lock onto these stories, we have a tendency to kind of build uh, characters, or turn real life people into characters that would fit in like a movie script. And so the every prosecutor who's taking on corruption becomes Elliot Ness.
Yeah,
Every spy becomes George Smiley. It's so and the incorruptible prosecutor who couldn't be bribed, can't be bought. This became a legend. You're right. Around Patrick Fitzgerald, I think I remember some of the same things. But with Mueller, for sure, this is a person who has a very complicated history. I mean, like
yes,
I didn't even want to go into that because there would be too much to get into there. But he's certainly not someone you can paint with a just a few brush strokes. This is somebody who has who should be a very nuanced rendition. Instead, they turned him into a cartoon character. Mueller the incorruptible going after Trump the corrupt, and I get that storyline, like, and it resonated with a lot of people, but that's not what we're supposed to be doing, I don't think. And we got way too into the salesmanship aspect of the story, I thought.
yeah, yeah. I like the comparison you used about. Well, first of all, maybe we should just cite that part of the article where you talk about the pattern, that there was a definite pattern to the Russiagate stories that had sort of the life of a flea. Um,
Right.
but you actually set out some steps about how it went.
Yeah, I've said this all along, that they're kind of like Drosophila, right? They're the fruit flies that they're born, they mate, and they die within the same day, or whatever it is. It's some incredibly short life cycle, and a lot of these stories were like that. They kind of like popped into the ether. They went on social media. They drove a series of headlines, and then very shortly afterward, within days or weeks, cracks would appear in the story. And we're not talking about like little factual errors. We're not talking about somebody getting a date wrong or something like that. We're talking about like the core meaning of the story would suddenly start to look less convincing than it was. And then sometime after that, the story would have to be formally walked back, and you'd see this in one of two ways. It would either be retracted or updated in the actual story, or they would just ignore it, and the job of doing that retraction would kind of be left to the conservative media, which would harp on it. But the problem with not having the correction high up and in your own press or outlet is that your own audience doesn't see it. If the New York Times makes a mistake and the corrections in the Daily Caller, no one's going to see the correction.
Yeah,
So and
that's right.
vice versa. That's a huge like sort of fundamental problem that we have with media today, which is that the landscape is so divided that we don't have to worry in the same way we used to about competitors giving us grief about our mistakes.
Yeah, there was real solidarity. And
Mm-hmm.
that was another interesting point that you had pointed out, and I had never thought of this, is that the partisan, this chasm between the partisan medias, where the majority of people on the left, I'm going to use that label loosely because it doesn't really apply.
Yeah,
But
right.
yeah, you could just say Russiagate skeptics and the people who are, Russiagate fanatics. So
Hmm.
they generally don't read each other's media. Now,
Right.
I was reading the more right wing stuff that I'd never normally read, but they, frankly, and you'll get beat up for this if you say this online. They were doing some good work. There
They
were a few
were.
people doing really real investigative reporting, whereas and a lot of it, most of it was documented. There were some people who had leaks who used anonymous sources, but that was the, I would say, minority case. Whereas on the establishment side, like I don't know, 2 years ago I started a hashtag anonymous source shit show because I mean it was crazy. It was
Yeah, no,
crazy.
you're absolutely right. And I found myself doing a double take because there were some reporters whose work I had run into during the financial crisis years who I just didn't have a lot of respect for. People like Byron York, right?
Right.
Who were suddenly, doing, they were, what they were essentially doing was going over a lot of the stories that were being published in the establishment press, and they were chasing them down from scratch in some cases, and finding out that they weren't always true. That was one way of, York did that a couple of times. But the reporter who I was really impressed by, who I never really knew anything about, was Chuck
Chuck
Ross.
Ross, yeah.
And he, he's at the Daily Caller, and of course, any, God-fearing Democrat or liberal, you have a natural reaction to the Daily Caller. But as a reporter, I'm reading this and I'm saying, well, first of all, he's got sources, he's documenting everything. He seems to have an urge to not want to lay things on sources. In other words, he like a lot of his reports were heavily document based, and he tried to get people on the record as much as possible. And it was really interesting. I thought that was, like, his work should have been followed up a little bit more, because it raised a lot of really important questions about what the origins of the story were. And there was a total crickets, when it came to that. It was basically a formal announcement that we do not follow up reporting that comes from that side of the aisle, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, yeah. And as you did a good job explaining why maybe so many people got duped from this thing is because they just never it never occurred to them to read the other side, because we've been trained to dismiss it. Um, I mean, and there were times I was even sort of reluctant to retweet and stuff because I was like, I'm going to get clobbered for this,
Oh
you
yeah,
know.
yeah. No, I
Yeah,
mean, you knew the instant. Like, if you tweet something from the Washington Examiner, um, that the first 10 tweets in response you're going to get are, "What are you doing retweeting the Washington Examiner?" You know what I mean?
yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
and it almost doesn't matter, what the, like, for instance, a really good example of that was when Christopher Steele filed his submission to the British court, saying that his report was raw and needed to be further verified and was not intended for public consumption. So this is Christopher Steele in his own writing. He signs the document. The document's public record. It's in the British court system. It only appears in the Washington Times. This story. Now, I thought this was an incredibly important story because Steele's report had just been the focus of a major congressional hearing in America, where it had been basically, read out as fact. And yet the only way you could write about it in the United States was to link to the Washington Times, which had the document.
yeah,
So I tried to chase down a copy of it from the actual court system, but then I thought to myself, that's not right. They did the work, they should get the
yeah,
credit. But people didn't want to hear it, so it was frustrating.
yeah, yeah. It really was. And you also pointed out another story. I did hear of it, and probably because I was trying to follow both sides. And that was the Greg Miller story about Prague.
Right, right. And I should point out that this is something that I got a little bit wrong in that piece. Is the one thing that Miller he did send a team to Prague, and all those quotes are correct, and he did tell that story. You can find it on C-SPAN and everything. I misunderstood when he said we went through every hotel. I thought that he personally had been there. He wasn't there. It was him. It was a Washington Post had sent a team of reporters there, but he wasn't among them. But
the work was still done, right?
The work was still done, and they obviously were looking for evidence that Cohen had been in Prague, and they didn't find anything. And he says this in his talk with C-SPAN. Essentially, I don't remember the exact words, were something like we came back empty. And my thought was, well, if you were going to send people looking for evidence of Cohen, I'm assuming that if you'd found it, you would have published that. So how is not finding it also not news? And this was a consistent theme throughout this entire time, where we were looking. This is why so many people believe that the Steele report has been essentially verified, or huge parts of it have been verified, because we don't really publish the stuff that's dispositive about the Steele report. And so we leave people with the impression that it's checked out, and that's been a disservice to readers. And ultimately, and I have to keep underscoring this point, because even though personally this has nothing to do with my motivation about this, but a lot of people, will argue that you're helping Donald Trump by pointing this out. And I think it's important to note that this entire mistake helped Donald Trump. And if that's what you're really worried about, and I don't think it's really the journalist's business to be trying to get in the middle of a presidential election, but if you're concerned about that, the last thing you want to do, the one thing you can't do, is hand him a big mistake that validates his criticisms of the mainstream media, and so we did that, I think. And
hugely. I mean, this is it's a major gift for him, and it's hard to underestimate. I mean, nobody knows what's going to happen between now and 2020 election, but it's hard to underestimate. As Edward Luce had some interesting things to say about this whole thing, but he went on Morning Joe the other day. I have some audio clips here, and maybe I'll add them in. You've probably already heard them, saying it's a bad day for Democrats.
U.S. national editor at the Financial Times, Edward Luce. His latest column is entitled "Robert Mueller is the God that failed Democrats." Wow. Okay.
Explain.
A bad day for Dems.
A bad day for Dems, in the same way that the appointment of Mueller by Rod Rosenstein was a very, very bad day for Trump. So I guess yesterday was probably the best day in Trump's presidency. The God that failed Democrats really put a lot of faith on this magic bullet of the Mueller report solving all their problems. And I think that postponed some of the sort of harder, less glamorous work the party needs to be doing, and that a lot of the Democratic candidates are doing.
So how did the Democrats do that? Because one could argue the media did it. One could argue Trump himself was drumming and fanning the flames of this report coming out. Witch hunt, winch hunt, they're out to get me. And media constantly sort of drumbeat, waiting for the report. That's not the Democrats necessarily. What specifically did the Democrats do to stumble here?
So it's the Democrats and all of the above. You're quite right. I'm using Democrats for shorthand.
That was a major British understatement, and and even so, the Mika didn't want to accept that, and Chris Matthews got all worked up about it, but then Isikoff spoke, It's a correction here. I said Isikoff, but I meant to say David Ignatius. You know, he's sort of a god in his own right in the media, or not in my view, but in his way he's presented. This speaks for the intelligence community, if you will. And he concludes all of it saying, but it's a good day for America, right? And Chris Matthews, who is all fired up, but what about, the Trump Tower? But what about this? But what about that? In the end, they say to him, they say, so Chris, what's the opening line for your show going to be tonight? And he says, well, yeah, I think I'll just say it's a good day for America. So they basically, if you haven't seen, I'll link that segment. It's just kind of hilarious. But
yeah,
there were some people right off the bat, I think, who were reflexively defensive about the criticisms, particularly yours, because I'm pretty sure everybody read that. I think that made its way around the mainstream media like lightning. But was it Margaret Sullivan from the Washington Post? She may be the first one to call you out, to respond to you. She sort of paints you as a bully, and she has a very defiant response to it, which I thought was really weak sauce, to be honest. She takes the word reckoning and she has a series of paragraphs. Well, I reckon that we got this story right, and I reckon that we got that story right. And don't be proud of, journalists should be proud of their Russiagate reporting, and don't back down to these bullies, right? So that's sort of the first reaction that we. At the same time, there's another Washington Post article that's being critical. But it seems like over the last couple of days, like it's almost like you broke the ice. Now we have some other big stories coming out, acknowledging the, the gravity of this whole thing.
Right. And if I could just address the whole bully thing for a minute.
Yeah.
I really wish that Margaret Sullivan could have traded places with me or Aaron Mate or Michael Tracy or Glenn Greenwald for the last 30 months and let her feel what that was like. These were deeply unpleasant times for anybody who let me just back up and just say my initial comments about this were incredibly conservative. Like all I really said at the beginning in my early columns on the subject was, we should probably avoid getting over our skis on this thing. Like let's wait to see exactly what we have here before we start making pronouncements. And we should, if the intelligence agencies are telling us X, Y, and Z, we should demand to know what that is because we have a right to see it.
Yeah.
And that was really the extent of what I was saying. Talk about bullying. Like I was accused of being a Russian spy, not just every day, but every hour at least. And other things happened. I mean, look, it was a very, very hard time to be, a person who wasn't on board with this thing. And look, that's part of the job. That's why I didn't complain about it at the time, and I'm not really complaining about it now. I'm just saying that if you're gonna talk about bullying, there was a lot of bullying that went on during the last couple of years, and it's one of the reasons why other reporters didn't want to say anything, because I think they were especially looking at what happened with Glenn Greenwald, whose very name became almost synonymous with villain online, mainly because of his skepticism on this front. It became this legend that he hated the Democrats more than he hated Trump. Why isn't he focusing on Trump more? And I know Glenn, and I think we had a similar reaction to this. It was just, sometimes as a reporter, there are certain things that just bother you so much when you're you're seeing something that's not quite right out there in the press. And I have low expectations for Fox News and for Donald Trump, but I have high expectations for the New York Times and the Washington Post, and they were disappointed, So I think that I know it's a rambling answer, but I just
No, I
think
think
that
it was fundamentally unfair to say that. I agree with that. I didn't mean to imply that I agreed with that in any way.
No, it's okay. And I'm sorry to interrupt just one more time.
Yeah.
It's also this is a trick that has consistently popped up in the press in the last 3 or 4 years. Bernie Sanders has been described as a bully. So the Sanders supporters, they're consistently portrayed as violent and threatening. Glenn Greenwald, in every single one of the many profiles of him, there was the New Yorker profile that talked about people being afraid to cross him and things like that. I think it was either the New York one or the New Yorker one, and this is one person. We're not talking about vast institutional power. So the idea of describing individuals as bullies when the flip side of the equation is a whole political establishment or a whole media establishment, I think it's that their balance is out of whack there.
Yeah, immensely. And in the smaller independent media circles, we were getting it too, and it was particularly scary because there was some institutional money going into some McCarthyite lists, trackers of Russian influencers or whatever word they use, Russian bots, Russian, useful idiots. Yeah. And, there was some government money in that, and there was some like NATO type money in it. And when you're someone like me, or even other independent media that are, that have an even bigger audience, we don't have a team of lawyers behind us. We could be easily bankrupted, and it's very scary. It's many, many, many times I thought about whether I should even open my mouth about this or not. But me being me, I did.
Yeah, no, of course you can't help it, but you're absolutely right, and some of those lists, Prop or Not was a big was the big scary unknown organization, and all this. The Washington Post did this sort of laudatory feature on them, and they were keeping a list of so-called useful idiots, and it was very conspicuous that a lot of the sites on their list, or at least some of them, ended up being removed from platforms like Facebook for what was called coordinated inauthentic activity. And so I did a story on that. I did a story on the whole thing about the zapping of sites that was going on by internet platforms that were now consulting with groups like the Atlantic Council. You mentioned NATO money. That's like a NATO sort of organization, and but nobody in the sort of mainstream, among my colleagues there, they weren't terribly concerned about it because it was all small sites, small independent media operations, maybe a husband and wife team, or some people who had invested their own money into trying to build up an independent media platform, and suddenly they're just off the internet, and I thought that was a very scary development, and very unfair, but nobody was interested in that story, and to this day I don't understand why, but that was another aspect of this, because all of those zappings and removals, they were justified on the basis of a national security argument that was made by the Senate, which said that it was necessary to prevent basically the Russians from, quote unquote, sowing discord And so we needed to police the internet more closely. So this is one of the early real world consequences of this thing that that we have to reckon with.
Right, exactly. And over that 2 years, we immediately saw independent media being suppressed in certain ways, like by boosting up. You would notice on your YouTube searches, all of the mainstream media videos would appear up at the top. So the search was clearly being rigged. And it got worse and worse as time went on. Just a couple of weeks ago, I did a podcast interview on Venezuela, and the day that I uploaded it, I searched for it on I searched under the one keyword. That's where most of the rigging is going on the top news item keywords. So I just searched for Venezuela, and I filtered it within the last 24 hours, and I go through the entire list, and my video's not there, and it has Venezuela right in the title. So I know that my work is being definitely not only
deranked.
Not only is it being deranked, it's being it's not showing up in the search results. But the reason I bring this up is that when you talk about real world consequences, and you go into this toward the end all throughout the article, but again toward the end, is one of the, what we got, the results. What were the results of the WMD story? No one was really held accountable. And, the national security state, the police state, if you will, the crackdown, the authoritarianism, the censorship has only grown. It's been more empowered. And we wonder now what is going to be the result of Russiagate. I mean, you intuitively say there's going to be some big lasting consequence of this, and anticipating what that might be. And I think you're, based on the history, you're right to predict that.
Well, if we look back at the WMD episode, and I think this was the part that people never really understood, because even if they got as far as saying there was never any consequence for the people who got it wrong, well, that's a good observation to make. It's true that most of the people who hyped the war kept their jobs, and in some cases, like Jeffrey Goldberg, they were even promoted. But the more important thing was the war was started on basically a lie, and then all of these other things happened as a secondary consequence. From rendition to torture to the drone assassination program to this sort of archipelago of secret prisons we now have all over the world. We've got bases everywhere, all over the planet. We're crossing borders without permission. We don't ask the UN if we want to go invade a country anymore. The Congress is no longer involved in declaring wars. These are massive, real world changes, and we basically all waved a hand at it. We didn't really worry about it, because the core problem was that people were afraid. They were made to be so afraid that they didn't protest these drastic changes to what used to be our constitutional standards about things like, asking Congress for permission to go to war and things like that. With Russiagate, you can already see the outlines of what they want. They basically want the same bag of goodies that they got for international purposes with the WMD
Exactly.
thing. They want that, but they want it domestically now. Yeah. Right? So they want increased surveillance. They want more control over the media. They want the sort of policing of political messaging. The idea that some people are useful idiots, or that some kind of political messaging is sowing discord. This is just code for we think that this is this kind of content is a national security threat, therefore it shouldn't exist, right? And so this is my worry, is that the real world consequence of the entire Russiagate thing is going to be this sort of wide sweeping movement toward authoritarianism, and that's also why I think it's extremely important now to go back and, with fresh eyes and determine exactly what happened in terms of the Russian meddling, the so-called Russian meddling, like what exactly happened there. Because I don't think it's been conclusively established that the DNC thing was actually Russia. I don't think it's been established that they were the source for WikiLeaks. I don't necessarily disbelieve it, but the source for that is the same source that got us in trouble with the Trump is compromised story.
Yeah, exactly. And the CrowdStrike report, the initial, ones who did the initial analysis. I mean, I did a number of different analyses of that, and I've read other people's analyses. I did an interview with Jeffrey Carr, and we were talking about, some of the technical details of that thing, and that is shaky as all hell, and the CrowdStrike is dubious. So yeah, I mean,
there's chain of evidence.
Not that I'm not willing to. What's that?
There's sort of chain of evidence issues there, like
all kinds of chains of evidence. They never physically got the servers, and they concocted this story about this Ukrainian app, military app, that just it falls apart on its own. But then a sort of a very respected establishment in the UK knocked it down too, because they used their data, and they were extremely upset about it. And the actual guy who wrote the app, the Ukrainian, he's like a low-level guy, good with technology. I mean, he knocked down a bunch of details on it too. And that original analysis is what the whole thing was based on. Not to mention the fact that attribution is really difficult to do. And some of the players here have extraordinary powers in the cyber world. So yeah, so it's a shaky story. I'm not saying that I don't believe that the Russians would have or could have hacked the DNC. I just haven't seen enough evidence to convince me.
Right, and it just, I was talking this over with some friends of mine with whom I worked in Russia back in the day, and our thinking throughout was, man, if the Russians wanted to give Hillary Clinton a hard time, they could have come up with something a lot better than this.
Yeah. They're simultaneously the gods of hacking technology, and then they also make these incredibly stupid mistakes to leave their fingerprints on it.
Right. I mean, they're gonna put Felix Edmundovich on the. Really, it's not necessarily dispositive, but it's weird. But more importantly, the Russians are pretty ruthless when it comes to trying to execute some kind of state disinformation campaign, or I was there when they released a sex tape involving the prosecutor general, Yuri Skaratov, who was chasing Boris Yeltsin at the time. They put it on national television, this guy romping with prostitutes. I mean, they're nasty about this stuff. And, the Clintons have a lot of history in Russia. There was, throughout the 90s, there was a fairly close relationship between that administration and the Russians. They could have gone in many different directions. If they had really and they could have done it lying, incidentally, right? They could have, I don't want to get into it. They could have fabricated all kinds of things that would have looked bad.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that they didn't do the DNC thing. It just felt like kind of weak beer to me, if that was their best shot. And but okay, let's stipulate that it happened. We still need to go in and make sure exactly that we understand what the deal was there, before we usher in a new era of tightly controlled internet communications and that sort of thing. That's the only point I was trying to make, is that we've now established that some of this stuff is less than reliable. So let's go back and let's do it all over again and make sure that we know exactly what we're dealing with.
Right, exactly. I agree with that. Yeah, and if you notice, there's a bipartisan consensus on what stories are going to survive the Russiagate scandal, if you will. And one of them is that Russia did attack us and Russia still is a menace. And Vox did an explainer on it, sort of like what you should still believe about this story. And in fact, that's kind of what Margaret Sullivan was doing too. So they're going to be willing to concede certain things, other things are going to be shady, but none of us should ever doubt that Russia tried to attack our democracy and that it could happen again. And here's what worries me on that. Well, not to mention the fact that it's a nuclear power, destroys any chance of rapprochement, any cooperation that we really need to keep from blowing up the world. But the other thing that I hear an awful lot of is that, our electoral system is so vulnerable. And we now have DARPA coming up with a blockchain, open source, new voting system. And, you had Dan Coates doing this giant intelligence guru conference at one point, this is months ago, saying, something has to be done about our electoral system. So, I mean, we have more to lose. I find that to be a very risky proposition. I like the decentralization of our voting systems, though I think most of them are awful.
Yeah.
But I definitely don't want a DARPA system, and I definitely don't want an electoral system that is uniform across the country and overseen by Homeland Security.
Right. Yeah. No. I think having it state by state is a good thing. It prevents actually. There's a good security argument against doing the unified thing, because let's even take it from the perspective of we really think Russia's out to get us, or some other country, whatever. It's much harder for them to penetrate 50 different systems than it is to get through one.
Yeah, exactly.
And I like the idea of the states retaining some sense of independence with regard to the federal government. I think that's important too. But the notion that this is going to be a universal consensus that Russia attacked our democracy, that absolutely is going to be a line that's going to be taken by everybody now. But and what's going to be forgotten, and already has been forgotten, is that relatively recently, before Donald Trump became president, this was a very serious controversy within Washington. Barack Obama took a very different view on all of this. He took a very different view on Russia. He very famously said that Russia is a gnat on an elephant's butt. And he was right about that. Russia's economy could fit into the size of the state of New York. Basically, as a military power, it's certainly a real geopolitical adversary, but economically, it's nowhere near anything like China. And Obama's attitude was, we should have some kind of rapprochement with Putin and the Russian government. Hold our nose, do it, and then have them as a partner to go after ISIS and perhaps stabilize countries like Syria or whatever. I don't know that I agree with every foreign policy tenet there, but this was something that where there was a divide in Washington on the thinking about this. Now all of a sudden, the people who are on the other side of that argument, some of whom are no longer here, like John McCain, but the sort of Hillary Clinton, Bill Kristol, Jamie Fly, neoconservatives, and Ashton Carter, the former defense secretary. This is now an unchallenged foreign policy consensus that we have to aggressively oppose Russia everywhere, right? And so it is kind of a new Cold War in a way. And is that the right thing to do? I don't know, but I think it's going to be a consequence of this story again, which is another reason why we have to make sure that it's right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I've been listening to Stephen Cohen on that Bachelor show every week for years now, when I was trying to understand what was happening in the Ukraine during the Maidan. So, I liked his perspective. I couldn't find it anywhere else. And then when the Russiagate, the 2016 election happened and the Russiagate thing happened, I stuck with it. He was a skeptic from the start, and he was making some really good points that I couldn't get anywhere else. And one of them was, and I found this to be really interesting, when the Steele dossier came out and when he read the Steele dossier, he immediately looked at it and said, this is just total garbage. And he said, and by the way, you can buy this kind of garbage in Russia, like anywhere, like on a street corner. And they will cook up any kind of conclusion you want, any kind of, target you want. And he immediately recognized it. He thought that some of it was actually crafted by a Russian or in Russia. After the fact, I'm adding this audio clip in, which is a clip from Stephen Cohen and John Batchelor on the John Batchelor Show, radio show, February 15, 2017. And it includes some of the things that I mentioned that Stephen Cohen has said in his analysis.
So this sleazy, for sale, blackmail type of trash that anybody can buy in Moscow or London or in Ukraine these days, about anybody, and first commissioned by Rubio and bought by the Clinton, we call it, when we do negative research on political candidates, what do we call it?
Opposition research.
Yeah, what is it? Opposition research. So this thing has almost no credibility. It's a combination, what it reports, of innocent and unverifiable, and that CNN, or at least the people leaking to CNN from the intelligence agencies, want to keep it alive, shows you that this campaign won't go away. But now we come to the crux.
I want to mention that the 52-year-old Christopher Steele is still, to my reading, in hiding. And I hope his cat is being taken care of properly by his neighbor. I just mentioned Christopher Steele is still not comfortable enough to come out and give the big 60-minute interview, Steve. We don't have
or comfortable enough, and he'd get a lot of money for a story or an interview. Comfortable, and he seems to need money because he does this for a living. Comfortable enough to defend the dossier that he compiled in segments over a several-month period.
And tell us what his sources were, yes.
Or assuming that he's in a position to come forward, I don't know.
And it's interesting because just a couple of weeks ago, in one of the right-wing news medias, there a journalist named Nicholas Balassi, here I have my notes, PJ Media, which I would never normally read, right? But yeah. I came across it through someone else, and they had an interview, a really quick interview with the Christopher Steele's ex-MI6 boss, right? Named, I don't know if you heard this, Sir John Scarlett.
Scarlett, yeah, who was very much involved in the WMD thing.
Yeah, so they catch Scarlett in the hallway at what is it? It was the Jamestown Foundation. I think that's an Uberhawk Foundation terrorism conference in Washington in December 2018, right? Mm-hmm. And they ask him, they say, I have the audio clip. I don't know if you want to hear it or not.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, actually, it's on a YouTube. I'll send you the link and I'll include it. But he basically says, they say, did you believe? He just immediately,
just casually, huh?
Just brushed it right off. Yeah, I'll send you that link.
Wow.
And I'll include it in here.
Russia didn't really come up during the discussion. I wanted to ask you about the dossier that Christopher Steele put together on Trump. What was your reaction when you saw the dossier and looked over it? Did you believe what was in there?
No, I looked at it and I thought these are commercial intelligence reports. I don't know what about the sources. They might be right, they might be wrong. And they'll probably be overrated, and they've been overrated.
So you don't think it'll be verified, many of the claims in there? And with Christopher Steele, because you worked with him, were you surprised that he would put together something like that with claims that were not verified on the president?
Well, they were commercial intelligence reports. And they were visibly that. So they weren't, it's a question of why they were there and where they came from and who commissioned them and so on. So I've tended to see them in that context, and they've acquired a political significance for all obvious reasons. But actually, if you think about it, people have talked about them in a really big way a year or so ago, and haven't really made that much difference.
Right.
As I said, I suspect all I can say is overrated.
What was he like when you worked with him, Christopher Steele? All right.
So just that quick. So Stephen Cohen immediately dismissed it, and this MI6 guy immediately dismissed it. And in the way he said it was like, of course not. He wouldn't say much of anything. By that, they try to get him to like say something about Christopher Steele, and he was like, I'm not going there. So, so you didn't even hear about this yet.
No.
Yeah. So if these two guys just immediately dismissed it, why wasn't there some skepticism about this thing, about the BuzzFeed? And I'm also very interested in why BuzzFeed actually published the details, because almost every Russiagate story, there are some very high-level statements made, ominous statements. But as soon as you scratch the surface on these stories and you ask for details or evidence, if you do actually get it, like very, very often it all falls apart.
Yeah, no, and one of the reasons it often doesn't fall apart is because people aren't asking that next question, right? So, if you're told, we know there are intercepts between Russians and the Trump campaign, your obvious next question is, well, what's in the intercepts? What are they? when were they? Who? Right? What Russians? Are they official Russians? Like these are things you just naturally want to know, right? And so yeah. And this is in every story. You always keep asking until the person runs out of answers, and sometimes people just don't know. They're not in a position to know. But if they are in a position to know and they're not telling you, that should start figuring into your calculations, because journalism is always about weighing, which sources are more right than others. Like for instance, when I had to cover the financial crisis, early on there was this whole question of did financial companies intentionally sell mortgage assets to institutional investors that they knew were overvalued, right? And I probably talked to 20 or 30 people early on in one of my first stories, and then maybe 3 or 4 of them said the answer was yes. The rest of them said no. However, those 3 or 4 were just more convincing to me, and it wasn't because I wanted the answer to be that way. It was just because of the way the answers came back when I talked to everybody else. The other people seemed, the people who were telling me yes were eager to tell me everything that they knew. They were eager to make concessions when they didn't, if they were wrong about something or if there was a hole in the argument, they were eager to concede it. So you always want to weigh what you're dealing with sources, and I just don't think that happened in this case. I think people heard what they wanted to hear and then they ran with it.
Yeah, and I gotta let you go, but there's one more thing I want to ask you about. Speaking of your reporting on the financial services sector, you pointed out something here that I thought was really important, and that was the way that the Steele dossier was handled. You said that this kind of thing is done as a short seller trick in the financial world all the time. Can you just explain that real quick for our listeners?
I'm sorry, what was it a quote again?
The short seller scam. Yeah.
So yeah, I did a couple of stories. One of them involving a Canadian company called Fairfax, and the trick here is you have a bunch of people who want to bet down a stock. So there's a whole bunch of short sellers, and very often then they actually think there's something wrong with the company. An early example might have been Enron. Like there were people like Jim Chanos who thought the company was screwed up, that the books didn't make sense. And so what they'll do is they'll prepare a report, or they'll hire like an investment bank or somebody else, a private research firm, to do a report on a company. And then they'll kind of make the rounds and talk to regulators. Usually in this case it would be a financial regulator like the SEC, but sometimes even it would be the FBI or some other law enforcement body. And the moment that the law enforcement body takes possession of that report and says, okay, we'll read it, we'll look into it, then the short seller or the private research firm, they call up a friendly reporter and they say, we can confirm to you that this company's under investigation, right? And so at that moment, everybody, they've all prepared for this moment when the headline is going to come out and say that X company is now under investigation, which of course makes the stock go down and makes everybody win. And so it's kind of a trick that you use in the finance sector. There are a few examples. It's not. And in many cases, the target company turned out to have real problems, like in the case of Enron. So it's not always necessarily unethical, but it is something, because I had seen that before, and some of the people who ended up investigating Russiagate on the Hill, they had also seen this before, and so the rollout of the Steele report reminded me of that a little bit, because it was a private report that was kind of, people went door to door to various members of Congress and the FBI, and they tried to get them to sort of take it. I don't exactly know what happened there.
No, but it was important to get into the FBI's hands. It was clearly a major goal of theirs to get that report to the FBI, and then they could say it's under, they're under investigation.
Exactly. And this provided the pretext for the initial story by David Korn, who, I should underscore, he's taking some heat right now. I should underscore, he did nothing wrong in that story. Like by the rules of our profession, it's totally legitimate to say the FBI is actually investigating something, right? And in fact, we know now that there was an ongoing FBI investigation. It may have been flawed, but there was one that was going on at the time.
The counter-intel one, yeah.
The counter-intel one, yeah. So that's how that trick works. And I think it's kind of a flaw in the system, because what it allows you to do is introduce unverified information into the kind of public consciousness by means of talking about who has it, who's looking at it, and so on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it answers a big question I think that a lot of people have. Is like, why did they go to such great lengths and using all of these different layers of people to, why was it so important to get that dossier into the FBI? You had all different kinds of people doing it, and I think that it might answer that question. So I think it's a valuable thing.
Yeah, you have to take that information in conjunction with the fact that they had already directly shopped it to all of the news organizations who wasted an enormous amount of time trying to confirm the details in the report, like especially the most salacious parts of it. I heard rumors all throughout that fall about people in the business who were chasing down something about some kind of research report involving Trump and Russia. I never heard exactly what it was, but they never published any of it because they couldn't verify it. So they needed to do something else to give reporters a way to talk about it, and so that's what that was.
And then that ultimately happened when Comey attached that to the intelligence report that they took to the Trump in the Trump Tower, and they told him Comey told him it would be kept close held, closely held, and within 3 days it was everywhere, right?
Yeah, like literally, like that second, everybody in DC heard about that meeting, and so yeah, that was the ultimate example of this. Well, like, what is the purpose? What is the real purpose of that meeting? Like, why are you handing over this document that, again, this is the CIA, the NSA, and the FBI. They have the most awesome investigatory powers on Earth. They have access to everything. They should have been able to determine relatively quickly what was true in that report and what wasn't. And yet, they, rather than sort of do an assessment on that, which would have been interesting, they hand this thing kind of just unvarnished to Trump and to Barack Obama, and then suddenly everybody in Washington hears about this meeting, and we can write about the meeting, and because there was intense interest in the idea of, well, what's in that document that was so dangerous to Donald Trump, that certainly figures into BuzzFeed's decision to publish the whole thing. And so yeah, I don't think it ever gets published. I don't think BuzzFeed ever takes that step without that meeting. So all that stuff is important. I think it's something that has to be investigated down the line, is the chronology of all those interactions between Comey, Clapper, and Brennan during that period of time. Like, what exactly was their thinking going into that meeting, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I agree. All right. Well, anything else that you want to say? You should let people know where to find your work and how to support your Substack.
Yeah, I'm at, first of all, you can find me just at www.rollingstone.com. I write a couple of pieces a week there online, and I'm in the magazine, obviously. And then for this particular project, you can find it at taibbi.substack.com. And the essay on Russiagate is free, but the rest of the book, this is really part of a book that I'm writing about the media in general. That's for subscribers, but this essay is free.
Well, thanks again, Matt. I really appreciate it, and it was great talking to you.
Great talking to you too, Joanna.
And that's our show. Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Matt Taibbi. Follow Matt on Twitter at mtaibbi, MTAIBBI. Find his articles at Rolling Stone, and find his book writing subscription at taibbi.substack.com. Around the Empire podcast is listener-supported independent media. Pitch in if you can at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please help me build up the YouTube channel by subscribing. That's free. youtube.com/c/aroundtheempire. Follow us on Twitter at Around the Empire. The audio podcast is the main focus for Around the Empire, where we have the most traffic. There are many ways to listen to it. Find it and subscribe on your favorite podcast app, or listen to it on the website aroundtheempire.com, or on patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or on YouTube, youtube.com/c/aroundtheempire. If you're listening to this on YouTube, hit the thumbs up to like the video. Leave me a comment. Don't forget to subscribe. I'm working on a new look, new kinds of content, including video live streams, mini docs, and the like, and I'd really like your help to build up that YouTube channel. Appreciate it. We'll see you next time. Take care, everyone. Peace.